This is a lecture video, pages 863 through 879. We start at the year of the gun, 1968. We start in Vietnam. What was the Vietnamese New Year? Was always a ceasefire time during the Vietnam War, but there is a coordinated military attack of U.S. bases and against military personnel on Tet on the New Year, and it undermined America's pride in the Vietnam War. It was already not looking good, but this just makes it even worse. We are able to repel the attacks, but it just, even the Americans that are on the fence, it ruins them on the Vietnam War. Television coverage shows the brutality of the war, and when there's a request for 200,000 more troops, led to a reevaluation, and that it was advised Johnson to disengage. Senator Eugene McCarthy, strong showing in New Hampshire, and the entry of Robert Kennedy in the race, combined with the unraveling war, led LBJ to announce he would not seek re-election for a second term in office. On April 4th, 1968, MLK is shot by James Earl Ray in Memphis, Tennessee, and riots break out. Chicago, Washington, D.C., all over the country in fashion because because MLK was killed. Then about 2 months later, Robert Kennedy is assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan, and he is assassinated because Sirhan Sirhan kills him because Robert Kennedy backed Israel in the Arab-Israel conflict. Kennedy's death ensured that Hubert Humphrey would be the Democrat nominee, facing Nixon and George Wallace. Nixon is the Republican candidate. George Wallace is a Republican candidate, but he's basically the quote-unquote racist candidate. George Wallace ran on a platform of segregation then, segregation now, segregation forever. The Democrats' convention in Chicago attracted anti-war protesters who attacked police. And it's a big nightmare, causing some confusion and distrust of the Democrat Party, and Nixon wins in a close election. Nixon had no secret plan to end the Vietnam War. Protests culminated with the Vietnam moratorium on October 15th, when 2 million participated in protests. The New Left had split into factions. The Weather Underground adopted a more aggressive, violent stance, and Nixon eventually comes up with a plan for Vietnamization. So the New Left, the left side, the Democrat side, splits. This Weather Underground was actually a really violent, you could actually call them in today's terms, a terrorist organization. And they have a violent stand against Vietnam and against the war and against the Republican Party. So Nixon's plan was to slowly withdraw American troops and replace them with the South Vietnamese troops. And again, that is known as Vietnamization. However, Nixon launches a secret war against Cambodia. And once students hear about it, it stimulates protests that shut down universities and lead to 6 student deaths at six student deaths at Kent State University, where police officers fire into the crowd, killing individuals in a peaceful protest. Negotiations began in 1972, which leads to a ceasefire in 1973, and the United States withdraws its troops. By 1975, South Vietnam collapses, and Vietnam is unified. Nixon opened up relations with China that helped to improve relations with the Soviet Union. He opened up relations with China by sending our ping pong team to play against the Chinese. The United States and the Soviet Union signed the SALT Agreement, or Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, in 1972, limiting the number of nuclear weapons we would have. Nixon called his policy détente, which is an easing of tensions, and implied that the United States and China would recognize mutual interests in Asia and that the Soviet Union was equal in the world. Okay, lessening of tensions, détente. Nixon is the first sitting president to go to China, and here he is at the Great Wall. Nixon's domestic policy was geared towards solidifying the Middle America, which he held. If we go back here real quick to this, Middle America held by Nixon, okay? And so he wants to solidify that, hang on to it so that he can win re-election. He ignored troubled big cities and tilted spending towards the suburbs. Of course, they are the ones that are supporting Nixon. Nixon's new federalism policy was centered on general revenue. So just like the Great Society was LBJ's domestic policy, new federalism is Nixon's domestic policy. And it was centered on general revenue sharing that passed federal funds directly to local governments with no limits on use. So we're going to give you the money. You do with it as you please. Which puts the money in the hands of the state. In the 1960s, inflation became an issue and continued to affect the American economy in the 1970s. Inflation means things are getting more expensive. After the Arab-Israel War of 1973, Arab nations who were part of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, gave an embargo on exports to us. So the price of gas doubles and then doubles again. So right now, price of gas in Texas, roughly $2.50. It would double to $5 and then double to $10. So it would be very expensive. Long lines at gas pumps. They'd run out of gas. Rising prices and ration systems panicked Americans who depended on their cars. If your license plate ended in an even number, you could get gas Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And if your license plate ended in an odd number, you could get your gas Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. And you could only get 10 gallons total. And sometimes they didn't even have enough gas to supply the people that needed it. Rising energy prices forced Americans to watch their energy consumption, including changing their thermostats, warmer in the summer, cooler in the winter, and switching off lights all the time. If you have parents who come behind you and tell you to turn off all your lights all the time, this is because of the 1970s. The underlying problem with the American economy went untreated, and America's economic dominance declined. OPEC again had demonstrated its power with an oil embargo, while the economies of Japan and Germany surged because they're getting the oil from the OPEC countries. In the 1970s, most Americans agreed on environmental issues. Conservation grew into a multifaceted environmental movement. Pollution became a national issue after the publication of Silent Spring in 1962 by Rachel Carson. You'll need to remember that for the EOC. On April 22nd, 1970, we have the first Earth Day, which gains a grassroots following across the country. And Earth Day, you're supposed to, plant trees and do good for the environment. In 1970, Nixon signs the National Environmental Policy Act, which creates the EPA to oversee environmental monitoring and cleanup. And it will be used quite frequently. Again, we switch to try to find alternative fuels other than fossil fuels at this point in time. And so here we are harnessing wind. Here are some of those lines at the gas stations. Chain of events that undermined Nixon's presidency began with the publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971. This is when the first time the media goes after the president, and it was that they were lying about Vietnam. In response, the White House compiled a list of journalists and politicians who opposed Nixon, and Nixon set up a special investigation unit to prevent information from leaking from the White House. Nixon was always so worried about the Democrats and what they had on him. And so when he wants to get reelected, he starts this new committee known as the Committee to Reelect the President, which the acronym for it's kind of funny, CREEP. And supposedly, unbeknownst to the president, they were going to gather information on the Democrats and what they had on Nixon. And so they break into the Watergate Hotel where the Democratic National Committee office was. And it says an apartment building. It's also a hotel. But they break in there and they're caught. The president denies knowing about it, but it's his men. And it becomes this big scandal. And the president, it will come out that the president knew about it and he lied about it. And it'll be one of the reasons why he resigns before he gets impeached. The attempt to cover up the burglary, as I said, came apart and eventually led to the resignation of Nixon. Environmental decades, the thing that each one of these 4 presidents did, you should know this. Ford was appointed president. Okay, so before Nixon gets busted, Spiro Agnew, who was the vice president under Nixon, resigns his vice presidency because of tax evasion, bribery and income tax evasion. So he resigns. So Nixon puts Ford as his vice president. Well, then when Nixon has to resign, Ford becomes president. So he was never elected to be president. He was never elected to be vice president. And so he kind of makes a deal with Nixon that if Nixon will resign, he'll pardon him as soon as Nixon resigns, so that the country doesn't have to go through, a trial of Nixon. And basically what he says to everybody is that we are going to try to heal as a nation. Ford also offers clemency to thousands of draft resistors, including the ones that fled to Canada. The United States joins the Soviet Union and 35 other nations to sign the Helsinki Accords. We'll talk about what that is in just a minute. But during Ford's tenure, the economy slid into recession and inflation worsened. Okay, so let's just talk. Just remember the word stagflation. We'll talk about that in class. I don't have time to talk about it on here. My time's going to run out. But Ford lost the 1976 election to Jimmy Carter. Here's the Helsinki Accords. It set up boundaries after World War II, including agreements on human rights and where nations were and things of that nature. It's kind of like hey, we're going to start easing our way back to being more civil towards each other. And here you go. Here's Carter. Carter wins not very handily. He barely wins. So it's a split country yet again. Jimmy Carter comes out of nowhere to win this presidential election. Oop. Carter's biggest problem was the economy, which slid into another recession in 1978. Oil prices got worse, and interest rates rose to more than 20%. And just for a little example here, that in 2019, right now in May 2019, the percentage inflation rates are roughly 5. So, it's a huge, which affects home buying and home building and buying cars and all sorts of stuff. Carter proposed a comprehensive energy policy, and Congress created the Department of Energy, but refused to raise gas and oil taxes because gas is already so expensive. Oil is already so expensive. The Energy Policy and Conservation Act encouraged alternative sources of energy like we talked about. Ford and Carter faced massive problems connected to this economic transition, which undercut efforts to develop effective government programs. We deindustrialize, we start automating things, and the decline of heavy industry and the decline of agriculture hurts America. Carter's biggest thing is the Camp David Agreement, which is signed between Israel and Egypt to stop fighting in 1977, and that is a big win for him. And then we'll talk about SALT II and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and keeping the United States out of the Olympics in 1980.